and welcome to Business Connections. I'm Holly Allen, Director of Marketing and Communications with the Dayton Area Chamber of Commerce. This program is produced by the Dayton Area Chamber of Commerce. Well, it's here, a new year, a new look at 2015. Many of our businesses are planning for hopefully growth and success for 2015. The Dayton Area Chamber of Commerce plans to help our businesses do just that, grow and succeed. And part of the puzzle is understanding the economic forecast for the new year. And to help them do that, to arm ourselves for what might be to come, we have asked Mr. Thomas Traynor to be with us. He is a professor of economics at Wright State University. So, Mr. Traynor, I want to thank you for being with us today.
Oh, you're welcome.
Well, before we take a look at 2015 and we jump into those predictions, let's take a step back and reflect on 2014.
Sure.
How were we at ending the year trending based on those predictions that were made about a year ago now?
The region came through pretty much as was predicted. The employment and income trends in the area continued on sort of the same tracks that had been. The overall performance of the local economy has been fairly flat the last few years. I think we're going to come in by the end of the year with employment being about 1% above last year, back to the levels we saw in 2012. So it's consistent with the overall trend. Being up 1% is better than not, but it still lags the national employment growth, which will come in at over 2%. But all in all, the region's economy didn't experience any real negative surprises over the past year, and I think things came through pretty much as one would have expected if they were looking forward a year ago.
Okay, so you would say that things tracked pretty much as you thought a year ago.
Yeah, I think things were pretty close to the way we expected they'd be. So
nothing surprising, good or bad?
Not particularly. I mean, we have continued announcements of some new warehousing and transportation facilities in the area. I think that had been anticipated to some degree. It doesn't create a lot of employment, but it certainly does create some employment. And it's consistent with the fact that this region of the country, not just Dayton, but other areas around this part of the Midwest, are becoming important centers for many industries as they look to improve their supply chain management in a way that reduces their transportation and warehousing costs. So, we're certainly sharing in the benefits of that new thinking.
Is it a continued climb? Are we still recovering from the 2008 recession?
Oh, yes. To some degree, we lost some jobs that we'll never get back, in particular the General Motors plant closings. So we're still over 20,000 employees below the level of employment that we had in 2007. So I don't think we'll come back or recover all those jobs anytime soon. But we did level off pretty quickly, and we did have a recovery of about 8,000 jobs since we bottomed out. And we very well could have another, 4,000 or 2,000 to 4,000, I'd say would be a better range to talk about in terms of total employment growing next year.
So it sounds like at least it's a steady climb, albeit slow.
Another 1/2 to 1% to 1% growth. Yes.
Okay. So you mentioned a little bit, we're talking 2015, and I know you like to separate them into the first half and the second half because it's a long year. Can you talk about, starting out, what do you expect overall for the region's economy in 2015, and then how do you think we'll end the year?
Well, I think it's usually easier to talk about the first half. There's just so many things that can change during the first half of next year that affect the second half. But again, we're aware of some new facilities that are going to come online and employ several hundred people, or even over 1,000 people in one case next year. And so we know that good news is going to be impacting the region. I don't see any real, or I don't foresee any sort of real negatives at this point in terms of major job loss in the first half of the year. So I think we're going to see that sort of increase again, sort of a steady, slow increase in the first half of next year. But the Fuayo plant, the auto glass manufacturing plant, is going to open up, and they're planning on hiring about 800 people. Procter & Gamble has their facility that's going to have over 1,000 employees. And so those kinds of effects are going to provide some measure of benefit to the area. Not tremendous benefit, but certainly it's better to have those kinds of events occur than not.
Okay. So there's no game changer here.
Yeah, there's no huge game changer, but at least we're continuing to experience moderate growth.
And you did mention that there were those really good news stories that came out. Fuyao, you talked about P&G. CareSource expanding. There's continued growth at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Those things are all going on. What industries, though, do you think will see the most growth, and what ones should we keep an eye on for 2015?
Yeah, I think the ones to keep an eye on are largely going to be industries I expect some growth in. One we haven't talked about yet is healthcare. Healthcare has just been sort of a steady performer for several decades now, and the Dayton area healthcare sector really doesn't just serve only sort of the 4, 5, 7 county area. It really does serve the population halfway up to Toledo and halfway over to Indianapolis. And so it does provide a decent flow of income from outside the region to the region. So it's a pretty important industry to this area. And it's been growing on average about 1,000 employees a year. And I expect to see that, or I don't see any reason why we won't see that again next year. There are other factors. There are a variety of factors that go into that, but the main ones are demographic, just the aging of the population, any growth in population in that broad area that I just described, even if our sort of core counties aren't growing in population. And then just sort of the development of new healthcare methods and techniques and services. So I expect healthcare to grow. Transportation, warehousing, and wholesale, we've already sort of described that. But I do expect continued growth there, again, as especially manufacturers throughout the country start to look at Dayton, Cincinnati, Columbus, Toledo, Indianapolis, that sort of cluster of cities, even going down to Louisville, as places where they want to locate large warehousing facilities. And we'll see trucking, employment associated with that growing. And I wouldn't be surprised to see some warehousing activity, or I'm sorry, wholesale trade activity. Sort of look at this area more seriously over the next few years. Maybe not the first half of next year, but that's the main areas. Manufacturing, as we're seeing with the Fuyao plant, we're going to get a little bit of growth there. Now, manufacturing is a trickier one to follow because manufacturers are doing a good job of becoming ever more efficient and figuring out ways to cut costs while they produce things. And so there's sort of a mixed bag there as pay continues to decline in manufacturing or has declined in manufacturing. Maybe it's reached its bottom, and employment sort of declines. So even though we might pick up 800 jobs in one place, you have other facilities that are dropping 10, 15, 20 here or there as they become more efficient.
Right.
So it's hard to say what the net effect is there.
Okay. And I was glad to hear you mention the distribution, warehousing, logistics, because that's something the Chamber is looking at quite a bit for 2015. We announced in November of this past year that we'd be launching the Dayton Logistics Association. So that's something the Chamber is keeping its eye on. And I kind of wanted to talk about that a little bit because a recent Brookings Institute report found the Dayton area was 54th in the nation for the transportation of goods, transporting more than $72 billion a year throughout the region. So again, logistics, do you think that will be a really big industry to watch for 2015?
Yeah, I mean, I don't expect anything spectacular to happen in any one given year, but I would say over the next 5 years or so, we're going to see steady growth in those industries beyond the levels that we saw, say, over the previous 10 or 15 years. I think, as I said, it's going to affect this region of the country. So Dayton's not necessarily going to be unique or stand out all that much compared to other areas. We're at the intersection of two major interstates, I-70 and I-75, so that certainly helps. We are roughly in the geographical center of a huge population area of North America, and so that's a big factor. And we'll certainly get our share of that. So as I mentioned, some of the other cities in the region, they'll get their shares of that growth too. But I do think that we can look to that industry as a source of growth, bit by bit. I don't expect suddenly 2,000 new jobs to show up in that industry in 1 year, but maybe over 5 years. And so that is an industry that can provide a real positive impact to to this region in the coming few years.
That's exciting news.
Yes, I think it is, because we've been looking for an industry that could be a source of employment growth, and that could be one of them. So I certainly look forward to that. Yes.
Well, we're talking here regionally, we're talking locally, but I'm sure that when you put together these predictions, you are looking at the nation as a whole. There have been some issues in D.C. between Congress and the administration. How much does that affect our regional economy here?
Well, mainly through the Air Force Base, through Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The good news, I guess, is that just last week there was a budget agreement reached in Washington that seems to be covering, the government's expenses for the next year. So I think things are a little bit more settled at this point than they have been in other years at this time, or in previous years at this time. So I think that's a plus. The Department of Defense is looking for ways to economize, and so that is going to have somewhat of a negative impact on Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. But on the flip side, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base really has a critical mass of important activities, and so sometimes when the Air Force decides to shutter relatively small operations at smaller bases, Wright-Pat becomes one of the locations that they tend to want to move those positions to. Again, it's hard to figure out or predict what the net effect of that'll be, but as the Air Force looks to consolidate in fewer regions, we'll become a region that benefits from that. But as the Air Force looks to economize, we'll see some disbenefits from them trying to cut back. So it's hard to predict the net effect, but Wright-Pat I expect will continue to be a huge, important factor in this economy, providing a lot of very good paying jobs for many years into the future.
I can imagine when you're looking to put together your predictions, Wright-Pat is definitely something that you look at, how it will be affected for the coming year.
That's right, and I do look at the federal budget and how much of that is being allocated towards defense, and so that looks like it'll be, again, fairly steady, maybe a slight decline in defense-based expenditures, but as I mentioned, as they consolidate, that does bring some benefits to the area as it can move jobs here from other areas in the country. Another thing to mention is, for a number of years there has been some discussion about somewhat aging workforce, especially among engineering personnel at the Air Force Base. And I think in the past week, the Dayton Daily News ran a story about how they're planning to start hiring to replace retirees and people who've sort of aged out of their workforce. So in a way, that's good news that the base is committed to continuing to keep those positions.
Just for reference here, Wright-Pat has an economic impact in the area for $4.4 billion. So people at home realize how big this is for the Dayton region, if you didn't already know.
That's right.
Unemployment, another big factor in this. So just a few numbers here. Unemployment for the Dayton MSA, currently 4.7%. Ohio's 4.6%. The nation as a whole is 5.5. Do you think for 2015 we'll stay there? We'll stay right around with the state, but a bit below the national number?
I think so. One thing I would like to mention is that I caution people right now, while we're still recovering, about taking the unemployment rate figures too seriously, because quite a few people with the depth or the severity and length of this last recession, there are quite a few people who I think would like to work. At least there's a lot of survey data indicating that with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who've just sort of dropped out of the labor market, and so that's caused the denominator, of that ratio, the unemployment rate, to cause the unemployment rate to look maybe a little lower than it really is. So as I mentioned earlier, we're still about 20,000 employees down from the level that we had in 2007. Now, some people retired, some people have moved away, but undoubtedly there are other people who are just sort of sitting on the sidelines waiting for the job market to improve, and they're going to enter. And so as we get more employment in the region, we'll also get more people, I think, in the next year starting to jump back into the labor force. So Yeah, the unemployment rate probably will not change a lot, even if things improve, even if employment improves for the region. But I do expect it to, at least if you're looking at the statistic, to stay a little bit below the national average, for the next year. But overall, as I mentioned earlier, I do expect, even though that's going to remain flat, there to be somewhat of an increase in employment over the next year.
It's an interesting look at the numbers. Might
Didn't
not
mean to get too technical there.
No, but it's interesting because you look at the numbers and you think it doesn't really flow if we're adding jobs and unemployment is staying the same.
Yeah.
It makes sense. That would be a reason why. Well, we talked about unemployment, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Again, that installation, do you think, are you looking at more jobs there, or?
Not necessarily.
You talked about engineering.
Yeah, but that's largely replacing retirees. So I don't know that that's not necessarily going to be a net increase unless they've been letting some of those those positions from retirements be unfilled for a while. I'm not really sure about that, but the overall effect at the base, I think, is a little bit hard to predict. So as I was just mentioning a few minutes ago, the positives are when the Air Force decides to relocate activities from smaller facilities to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
So that would be BRAC related?
Well, right now, not BRAC related, but it still happens even separate from the BRAC process. So if it's going to happen in the next year or so, it'll be separate from the BRAC process. It'll just be the Air Force making an executive decision that they need to move 200 jobs from one place to one of their few very large Air Force bases, and Wright-Pat is one of those. And so that's a positive, but those are hard to predict because it's just essentially an executive decision made at the Air Force. But on the flip side, they are looking to economize. They are looking for positions that they can do without, and so those kinds of cuts are likely to occur too. So there's going to be a mix, and it's hard to tell how it'll play out.
I would like to kind of end looking at, when you sit down to make these predictions, it seems like such an overwhelming job. We talked a little bit about the components you look at when you're doing that. Talk about the steps you take to make a prediction for the upcoming year. Sure.
Well, the main thing I try to focus on is to look at industries that I consider to be export industries. When I say that, I don't mean exporting their goods and services to other countries, just exporting them outside of the Dayton area, because that provides a flow of income to the region from outside of the region. So that is federal government employment, mainly Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Manufacturing is still important because we have a lot of manufacturers who sell goods all over the region or all over the country or even beyond that. So manufacturing remains very important, even though it's shrunk somewhat in its importance. And then healthcare. Those are the three main industries I sort of watch. And then from there, the health of those industries helps me model. I use a statistical model. But being able to track those three industries allows me to then be able to make some predictions about what's going to happen in other industries. The last industry that I'm starting to look at pretty closely as an export industry is transportation and warehousing. And so I use that. I just started using that this year. I'm experimenting with that as a predictor of the rest of the region.
So again, we talked about that possibly growing in the future and maybe being something that will be a really big industry in the Dayton region.
Right. And sort of what follows from that then is that we get income into the region from those particular industries. And then that supports all the retail, for example. That supports all the activities that we undertake in entertainment, going to movies, buying groceries, buying clothing and all that, all those activities. So those industries are dependent on sort of those export industries. So that's essentially how the prediction is developed.
Okay. Well, Mr. Traynor, I want to thank you so much for being with us today. We appreciate your insight because it's something that you don't really get such an inside look at.
Well, I'm happy to do it. It's no problem.
Well, I want to thank you for watching. Again, Business Connections is a show produced by the Dayton Area Chamber of Commerce, and we're talking economic, the forecast for 2015. Just a reminder that the Dayton Area Chamber of Commerce produces economic indicators, and we do that on a monthly basis, so you can check those out at daytonchamber.org. Thanks for being with us today.
Each year about this time, the region's Chamber of Commerce uses its network and resources to develop a look forward into our area's economy. Naturally, There are many factors that can have impact on any region, including governmental policy, flow of investment capital, the stock market trends, and disasters. But short of knowing or predicting these, we gather as much information as possible in order to have one more piece of information our business community can use in determining their 2015 plan of action for running their organizations. Overall, 2015 appears to be improving, which makes us a bit more optimistic in our predictions that we will see sales and profitability improve, which then equates to more business reinvestment, whether in capital machinery, space, location, or for many, human capital investment. Jobs. These signs bode well for all businesses, no matter what size, as well as most industries, whether durable goods, housing, and services. The issue of a government shutdown should be behind us, but we are still faced with many challenges as we go forward. Military sequestration, funding and repairs of our highway infrastructure system, tax burden, and energy costs, just to name a few. But the light seems to be shining a bit brighter as we go into 2015 because at long last, most of the remnants of the Great Recession are finally behind us. The Dayton area was hit hard in 2008, 9, and 10, on top of the losses of some of our largest employers. We've made up much of that ground, but not all. One of the most significant issues still lingering is the average weekly pay earnings, a range that was quite good during the Delphi, GM, and NCR era, but has dropped precipitously over the last 6 to 8 years. This affects our local spending power. Our future growth is tied to smaller scale businesses who must be even more aggressive and efficient going forward in order to take advantage of the opportunities that will present themselves in a more diverse economy. Our guests today will share more of their insights as to our economic forecast, but employers seem much more optimistic about 2015. I, for one, am glad to see our continued improvements.